Hi, my name's William Henderson,
And I'm B. McGraw.
and this is the Unjerked podcast. So, what we do is, unlike B. McGraw's website, which is
The Journal of Astrological Big Data Ecology, or JABD.com.
unlike that website, instead of writing fake academic journal articles, we look at real academic journal articles and see what we can find out about specific topics that are often talked about on Reddit and Twitter. So, this is part 3 of our episode on higher education. So, we're going to pick up where we left off.
It's our junior episode.
But anyways, like, who owns student debt? So the Brookings Institute looks into this, and the reality is, college, wealthier people go to college, and so wealthier people are more likely to hold student loan debt. And so it says that the highest income 40% of households own 60% of the outstanding debt. The lowest income 40% hold under 20% of outstanding debt. There are people who didn't finish college. There's cases like that, but on average, people who own student debt tend to be wealthier than people who don't. And I think that's part of the controversy behind forgiving student loan debt. And so let's talk about some of the gaps. So yes, people who go to college are wealthier and have better life outcomes on average, but there's edge cases. So according to the Pew Research Center, 38% of people who go to college do not finish within 6 years, which is much higher than I expected. And a big issue, so Brookings looks at the for-profit college system. So most colleges, whether they're private or public, they tend to be nonprofit institutions. And what you see with for-profit schools is that 10% of students go to for-profit schools, but they are half of all the student loan defaults. They tend to have worse life outcomes than both private and public nonprofit schools. And there's this article from Cornell that essentially says, this is not just explained by differences in, other correlative factors. This can actually be traced specifically to attending a for-profit school. They just tend to not be good schools. So that's one. So one gap in the system where people, suffer, I suppose, is like people who don't finish school. The other is for-profit schools, degree mills. And the third is just the overlap between the lowest paying college outcomes and the highest paying non-college outcomes. So when you look at, how much do tradespeople make? From what I've seen, it seems like it varies from like $45K to $100K, depending on skill level, how dangerous the job is. More dangerous jobs pay more, but that seems to be. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that's what I would suspect.
Yeah, and so so if you go to Forbes, Forbes' college list, they're actually much more focused on actual financial outcomes. They used to be much more, traditional metrics, but they're a lot more financial outcomes based. And you can filter for, median salary 10 years after graduation. So when you're like 30, 32 years old, roughly speaking. And the highest, at least in 2023, the highest was MIT at 182K or 182.8K median salary. I don't know if that includes bonus and stuff, but like,
oh wow,
MIT, Harvey Mudd, Princeton, Stanford. I mean, the usual suspects. When you look at the lowest paying schools, and I believe this is like the top 500 or 600 schools. So this probably doesn't include most degree mills and places like that. But I'm not going to name the names of these colleges, but the lowest paying had median 10-year salaries of like 80K, 90K, something like that. So on the surface, you could be like, well, that pays more than some tradespeople make more than 80K, like, very dangerous, working at an oil well, there's certain jobs that pay more than that, but it seems like most tradespeople make less than 80K or 90K.
Yeah, I'd say most people. Yeah.
But when you look at college major, that's when the difference becomes more notable. So there's this paper from Georgetown, or it's a white paper from Georgetown, and it looks at ages 25 to 59. So this looks at basically the whole working age population and the median salary for different college majors. The highest is, engineering, comp sci, business, etc., which is not very surprising. But when you look at the lowest paying majors, so education pays about 45 to 50K, psychology and social work about 50K, arts about 50K. So there does seem to be an overlap where, those degrees pay less than the trades pay, right? I mean, if you're if you're working the trades, you'll probably make a little more than 50K, or you might make up to 100K depending on, what particular trade you're in. I mean, this is not a perfect comparison because, like, I feel like the people who go into the trades are like a very different demographic from people who go into education. You know, like I feel like,
Yeah.
I feel like people are like, well, I could either teach kindergarten or like, I could, you know, work on power lines. Like, I don't think it's the same person who usually like picks between those two career fields.
No.
But it's a thing. I mean, like there are, if you go to a very low ranking college and you choose the wrong college major, like you probably will make less money than someone who becomes an electrician or who becomes, you know, does like,
But here's the thing, like I'm not saying that, and I don't think anyone would say that none of those studies should exist, but maybe you could scale how much money we as a society, like if these loans are subsidized by the government and there clearly is a economic value associated with them, maybe we can scale how we lend out that money based on how it's used by major, if there is such a clear expectation on how much it's worth.
I mean, that would be politically tough to implement, I feel like.
Yeah. But we're not
So
politicians.
alternatives, I mean, I think trade school
I
is a
feel
great
like you
idea.
could slip that in.
But, so what are the alternatives to college? I think for a lot of people who are not academically gifted, going to trade school makes a ton of sense, I think. Um, it seems like there's a limit to how far you can replicate. Because like college used to be, like Harvard used to be like the only university in the United States before we were even, we were still British colonies back then, but it was just Harvard. And obviously, like, if you argued back then, like, oh, we shouldn't have any more universities, one is enough. Like, obviously, that's ridiculous.
Yeah,
But like,
that would be insane.
but I feel like there's a point where it's like, how far can you replicate this? Because if you have a 4-year college that's ranked like 900th in the country, and the average person who graduates makes like 35K, like, is that really? I feel like that. I feel like the model can only scale so much before you have diminishing returns. As far as coding boot camps go, so it's tough
Yeah,
to
do
like.
coding boot camps work?
So, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that like, having an actual computer science degree is much more marketable in the job market than going to a coding boot camp. That's pretty obvious. There's not a lot of data on, according to Forbes, there's not a lot of data on the actual outcomes of different boot camps. But it says the median cost is $9,500, and the most common salary increase was between $10,000 and $20,000. So from a purely financial perspective, that seems pretty reasonable.
Yeah, that would
think.
make sense. And honestly, this might be something that I bet could trickle down to companies who need software developers. Most software development, you don't need a computer science degree. Like you don't need to take discrete mathematics to need to know how to develop a website.
Right.
And some of my other like programmer friends that are in academia, we've complained about this a lot, is when you're in like these comp sci courses, you get kind of two types of people, some that are there for the computer science and are really interested in some of the more advanced stuff, like whatever, like quantum computing or like actual, really, really advanced software architecture. And then you have like a good portion of people that just want to learn how to code, get out and do programming
Yeah,
for
just
the
be
money.
code monkeys basically.
Yeah, some people just want to be code monkeys, and they don't want to have to like learn about sorting algorithms. They just
Right.
need to know how to do it. Like I think there's a lot of space there that's starting to develop now.
There is space. I think I guess the overarching thing is like there shouldn't be a one size fits all approach to
Yeah,
all of this.
that's kind of what I'm saying, and what I'm noticing is like I think there really is space for people just learning how to code, because like there's also a lot of jobs where like yeah, if you can hire a coder cheaper than someone who's got like a full comp sci degree, yeah, you're gonna do that. I bet.
Yeah. I think apprenticeships, learn and earn programs, there should be more of that, like having the chance to actually do work experience while you're learning. As far as MOOCs go, so massive online, open online courses. So this research, there's this paper that looks at, what are their, you know, do they work? And they look in the context of like
What's some MOOCs?
massive open online courses. So like open courseware.
Oh,
They're looking at it from the
okay.
perspective of using it as a supplement within a course, that like within an in-person course. And they said that it had a positive influence based off a survey.
Oh, that's good.
Um, so it seems like it helps
Oh,
as a supplement. Is
one more comment on the coding boot camps, and well, this is probably related. Is I think they saw that tend to, and I feel like I read this somewhere, but I don't know where. The $10,000 to $20,000 bump in your salary probably has to do with people with normal office jobs that learn how to code, and then that suddenly makes them more valuable or more useful in the office. And I think we as a society are getting to a point where if you're working a white collar job, you should probably learn how to code.
Yeah, agreed.
It just
But
makes you more valuable as a person
right,
in a professional environment.
right. Um, so yeah, MOOCs seem to help when it comes to supplementing a course. They didn't go into. I think there's sort of like you because like every course that you can really take exists online somewhere if you really look for it. I mean, maybe not every, but like most major subjects, you can find all that info online.
Yeah.
Some universities have,
If you want to, you can learn about anything you want
yeah. I
for
think
free.
the two issues. One is how do you signal that? Because like you can't really prove. Maybe you can get a certificate or say you pass it, but like you could easily, look up the answers for like the quiz portion of one of those online,
Oh yeah.
things. And also like there's a pedagogical value in having an actual professor who can like answer your questions and stuff and explain concepts to you. So I feel like there's a limit to what MOOCs can accomplish. um,
Yeah.
I think there should be more national service. There should some countries have a gap year where you spend that time doing some sort of you either it's either conscription or it's more broader, like working in the civil service of some kind. I think
Yeah.
that is
I
something.
think national service should be more of a thing, because
Yeah.
also that just gives everyone, job experience across the board.
So solutions to the problem. So I think there's a couple options. I think, and I'm mostly talking about like the higher the student loan problem. Basically, how do we lower tuition? Um, Usually, the answer in my mind is like just have a pricing mechanism, and so just get rid of loans altogether. But the problem with that is like you'll just have essentially a class of people who cannot afford to go to college and don't get educated. And I think in most other cases, I'd be like, well, that's just how it works. But I think in the case of education, there's just a massive social benefit in people getting educated. So,
Yeah.
I think price controls might not be a bad idea. And the thing with price controls is that they lead to shortages. And so, this is one of those cases where I'm like, well, maybe there should be a shortage and there should be some sort of selection mechanism. So in the German model, they basically decide, pretty early on, when you're in middle school or high school or whatever, they're like, okay, who is on track to go to college and who's on track to like, go into the trades or something like that. And so only 28% of people go to college in Germany. But the people who do go, basically, it's paid for by the government. Um,
What if you used, and this is like kind of the earlier idea I was kind of riffing on, you made the pricing mechanism either through how much you're willing to let people borrow for a student loan or within the college itself, um, be scaled by your expected life outcome, because you might pay the same amount for an education degree versus a computer science degree,
mhm.
but your expected life outcome is going to be very different, earnings wise.
Yeah, I think the danger to that is universities might just say, we only bring in X amount of dollars from like people who study education, and so we can't fund the education department enough.
Oh,
And
that would
so,
be
I
true.
feel like that's
Yeah.
the argument that would be made.
Well, yeah.
Um,
Well, that's the thing, is like, if people were completely rational, then like why would you like go to these lower paying fields? But there's no way around the fact that as a society, you need people that are going to be in education and teach
what's
for
it,
kind of those
it's
lower
yeah, I mean,
end
you need,
fields.
teachers are a very important part of society, as are social workers. Um, the sort of perverse thing is, um, careers where people are more likely to be passionate about doing their job tend to be lower paying jobs, because I think when people are less passionate about their jobs, they're like, well, if you want me to do this thing, you need to pay me. Whereas I think when people are like,
Yeah.
this is the right thing to do, and I want to do this because it's good for society, a lot of those people are willing to accept lower salaries. I mean, that's, it's something people don't want to talk about, but it's a thing. Um,
Well, I think it's a little bit more than that. And here's a counter example is, if you are a doctor, I think most people that go through all of the process of a medical school and your residency and all of the work associated with that, they're usually pretty passionate about it. I don't think most people strictly go in for the money,
I
just
think I
from
think
the
there's people.
lifestyle.
I do think there's
Well,
people who
I
do it
know
for the
like
money.
some people do, but I bet most medical professionals do it because they're passionate
There's a
about it,
supply
and they
with
get taken advantage of because of that,
I
considering
think
how
with
much they work.
medicine's different because there's a supply constriction. There's only so many residency slots. There's also, I mean, you need legitimate years and years of training to
Yes.
actually be an effective doctor. I mean, no offense to someone who's a high school teacher, but like the amount of training you need to teach high school is like much less than the amount of training to be a good brain surgeon. I mean, it's not even close. Um, not saying one's more important than the other, but I think it makes it difficult to make a direct comparison. Um, I think moving on, I think so. The German model is basically college is free, but only some people get to go. Slight modification might be to also subsidize trade school as well. Because if you just subsidize college, then it's basically a subsidy for wealthier people ultimately. Um,
Yeah. Or the people
another
capable
might
enough to get
be
into those programs, and they're not going to need as much help.
another might be, like we mentioned before, national service. Maybe make college free or trade school free for people who do national service. That already exists in the military, through the GI Bill, but maybe that should be expanded to the AmeriCorps, the Peace Corps, State Department, national parks. There's a lot of different departments in the federal government. And I think it would be really cool if basically anyone who was willing to do 2 years of national service could get their school paid for. Like, I think that would be
I would
amazing.
be super down for that. I think that would also be pretty popular as well.
It would be popular, and it would just be a really good way to go to other parts of the country and to serve and to learn about, gain that civic pride and learn about what other people are doing. I think there's just so much there. There's just a lot of potential there. And then finally, I think one thing I heard is like make universities guarantors for student loans. So if the student defaults, then the university has to pay off the remaining balance. Um, I think there one danger with this is like it could turn off universities to higher credit risk students, which is typically poor students. So they might not accept poor students because they're more likely to default on loans. So there is a risk there, but it's something else to think about because right now, like, once you graduate, like the university doesn't care what happens to your student loans. Hey, don't want to sound harsh, but that's the reality. Um, so that's something else to think about. Or
They're
even if you
not
don't
banking on
graduate.
you giving to the alumni society.
Right. I mean, they're probably just like, they probably calculate like what, who will and who will not donate, whatever. So that kind of covers everything. There's a few tiny things I want to mention also. International students, how did they fit into the picture? I think the reason universities have international students is because they pay much, much higher tuition. So they're a huge source of revenue for universities. They are good. I would argue they're good for um, the system as a whole because more than half of Nobel Prize winners in the U.S. are people who are immigrants originally.
Oh, that's
So,
cool.
so I do think if you pick the right people to come to study, I think it's a net benefit for sure for society.
Well, I also think there's a huge value in having an internationally diverse student body for everyone as a whole, because then you get to experience different cultures and people.
Right. And one thing that a policy that does not exist that I think should exist is what's called a staple visa. So there's different types of visas. There's student visas, work visas, etc. And my understanding is that like if you get a PhD in the U.S. and your student visa ends, basically if you can't find it, basically they're like, okay, um, you know, thanks, now go home. And if you're lucky, you can find a job in the U.S. and get sponsored for a work visa, but it's not guaranteed. And so a lot of people who get PhDs in the U.S. they leave the US, and that's just a huge source of talent that we're just
Yeah.
foregoing. And so if you guaranteed for specific high um, demand fields and skill sets, I think it would be a great idea if we guaranteed work visas for people who get educated in the US. I think that would be a great idea.
Yeah. I am highly in favor of brain training all other countries. Yes.
So there's a big argument that brain drain's not as big of an issue as people think, because a lot of times, assuming, let's say there's brain drain and someone, talented person leaves a country. um, yes, if they never return to the country, that's a problem, but most times there's some sort of connection with the home country. And so a lot of times when you actually look at like where are the sort of new tech hubs in the world, a lot of them, there's a lot of tech companies in China now, and there's a growing startup scene in India as well. And there's an art, and obviously there's a lot of people from China and India who work in the tech center in the US. And so there's pretty compelling evidence that a lot of those people, they maintain connections with their home country, and there's sort of a back and forth as far as talent goes. So assuming that sort of relationship with that country is maintained, a lot of times a lot of that talent actually flows back to the home countries. um, when it comes to college sports, so I think there's a big debate about. I mean, it's not a huge debate, but like, what are college sports good for, basically? And I think sports in general, there's obviously huge benefits to athletics aside from just physical fitness. I think it's a way to have a school community. It's a way to develop leadership skills and teamwork skills. So I think most people would argue sports are a great thing. From a purely financial aspect, though, apparently most Division 1 universities did not bring in net dollars from
Oh, really?
from athletics. So
Hmm.
essentially, so football and basketball are like the huge money makers. They bring in a lot of cash, but a lot of less, popular sports are cost centers actually. And so
Huh.
according to this research I found, like I believe more than half of colleges, it actually cost more money than it made, interestingly enough. So I thought that was interesting. A separate
Interesting.
a
Is
separate
that
debate.
just from like ticket revenues only, or because I
So
imagine that some colleges bring in students that come because they have good sports programs to watch.
yeah, I mean that's definitely part of it too. Um, I mean that analysis kind of gets a little more difficult, but they're talking about generated revenues here. It's ticket sales, NCAA and conference distribution, contribution from alumni, bowl revenue, other, etc. And it seems to be. Let's see if we can open this up here.
But
Um,
can you really put a price on pride?
so when you look at net generated revenue, which is generated revenue minus total expenses, so it seems like it was mostly net negative, and it depends. It depends on the specific university, but a lot of universities actually use a net cost center. Um,
Hmm.
there's a big debate about should college athletes be paid. My answer is like, of course, like why shouldn't they? I mean, I think
If they're bringing in money, yeah.
the main argument, I guess there's like an argument from jealousy where it's like, they're already the cool kids and now they're going to make a lot of money too. Like, like
I listened
I,
to a debate on it, and I think most of the criticism is like you're basically going to turn the college sports into like a professional league, and now you're just going to get people that are in it for the money and not for the sportsmanship of it all. I'm like, I
well,
think you can be in it for
but
the
like
sportsmanship and make some money.
it would be a argument to make if like nobody was making money from college sports, but like, TV, you know, TV networks make a ton of money from college sports, and there's like a
Oh
lot of
yeah.
coaches make a ton of money from college sports. So to say like, oh well, they can make money, but the athletes can't because it's not sportsmanlike to make money is like a dumb argument. And
Yeah.
my view is like they like they're the ones doing it. Like why can't they get paid? Like it just seems like a reasonable.
And also, college athletes generally put in a lot of work. Like we knew people that were sportsmen in college, and the amount of extra work they put into their athleticism on top of getting a degree, that's like it just felt like a crime that they weren't getting anything extra.
And a lot of them also get pretty serious injuries. You
Oh
know,
yeah, there's risks associated. Yeah.
yeah, and so for me, it's a pretty obvious. Like, I think they should get paid whatever they can get on the market. Um, you know, so there's that. And then before we wrap up, the final thing is like, okay, um, how does like, let's say there's a university in your city, what is the net impact on that on the community itself? And I couldn't find any good answers. There's obviously the university has employment opportunities. I mean, frankly, a lot of them are mostly for people from outside the community, like professorships. You're not going to have local people becoming professors at a university. It's mostly going to be people from other states or other cities, right? um, and then also, most universities have tax exempt status, so that's a huge tract of land where there's no, property taxes being raised. And then on the flip side, a lot of innovation happens at universities, and if it's a very good research university, you can have a lot of spin out companies, and that could bring in a lot of money. So there's no obvious answer. Um, the reason I even like thought about this is like some universities are in very good cities, and then sometimes there's very good universities that are like in pretty sketchy areas. Like I'm not going to name names, but there's a lot of universities that are like a couple blocks away from like really sketchy neighborhoods. And I always thought like, it's weird. Like you'd think some sort of benefits would flow out from the university to, the local area, but I guess it's not an obvious clear cut thing. So that kind of wraps things up. I think the part I wanted to talk about the most is, the student loan thing. Why does college cost so much? And the answer is colleges are they're just spending money galore. They're just spending tons and tons of money because they can get away with it, because people keep knocking on the door, because people keep taking loans out. And so colleges just, keep expanding and expanding their administrative bloat, and they just spend money on tons of things that they probably don't have to. And that is basically the problem.
Yeah. And also it's kind of interesting how inconclusive it is on actual life outcomes, but it's also kind of a hard thing to study in the first place.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I don't really think student loans should be a thing unless they were optional. I think, some sort of system of subsidizing, the next step after high school, whether it's college or whether it's trade school, I think that would be a lot better. That would be much more likely to instill cost discipline in universities. If the federal government was basically, it's basically incentives. If they're like, hey, I'm paying for this as the government, you better rein in your costs. Incentives are a lot more aligned than, hey, I'm getting money from people who borrowed money from me as the government, and so I'm making money from costs going up. I think that's a big difference in incentive alignment. So I kind of, I almost feel like student loans shouldn't even be a thing for the most part. It should mostly be.
Yeah. Well, I think like it should either be free or you have student loans. But if you are going to have student loans, I think there should be more discrimination on who gets them.
Perhaps.
In an equitable and fair way, at least. Because like if you start making it only profitable motives, then you clearly get problems from that.
Yeah. I think
make it more of a meritocracy and how you use it.
This is a good example of an episode where the problem comes. I mean, there's the phrase like the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Like the reason this problem exists is because of a policy that was supposed to be helpful. The reason why student loans
and
were
it's
guaranteed,
probably helped a lot of people too.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why we have this problem is that the government subsidizes, student loans for everyone basically, and that does mean that almost everyone can go to college if they academically qualify. The flip side is you're paying for that on the back end. So like this isn't because there were evil people who came in, people online blaming or saying like, interest rates should be 0%. I'm like, well, that just makes the problem even worse. That, reduces the pricing signal even more. And, or people who are like, oh, well, the banks, I'm like, well, the banks don't own the student loans. The government owns the student loans. So like you see all these people angry at the wrong people. And I'm like, well, the problem is like, we collectively decided on a policy that ended up backfiring big time. So this is a case where like nobody did this out of malice. It just kind of ended up happening. And the solution would be what if the government said, hey, we're not going to let you borrow money to go to college? Like, I feel like that'd be pretty unpopular.
Oh my gosh. So many people. Well, the problem is so many people that should go to college won't because of that.
Yeah. So anyways, that's it for us. And we will see you next time. So please like and subscribe.
Yep. See ya.